Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anne Fitzgerald. I'm part of the Home for Good coalition of organisations and individuals, including academic, legal, housing and homelessness experts who believe that constitutional change is essential towards underpinning and successfully tackling our housing and homelessness crisis. So what is the purpose of our webinar this afternoon? The purpose is to allow our speakers to explain what a right to housing would mean in practice if inserted into our constitution, and then also to give details of how to make a submission to the Housing Commission, which is seeking public consultation and submissions, and the deadline is quite soon. It's the 2nd of September. So we're encouraging people to make submissions, and we will outline to you how that can be done. So we have 3 speakers this afternoon. We have Aoife Desmond, Kelly Desmond, from Managing Solicitor from the Mercy Law Resource Centre. We have Dr. Rory Hearn from Maynooth University, who is well known in the area of housing and homelessness. And we have Anne-Marie O'Reilly, who is the policy officer with Threshold. So without further ado, I think we should kick off. And our first speaker today is Aoife Kelly Desmond. She's working in the Mercy Law Resource Centre, which is an independent law centre and charity providing free legal advice and representation to people at risk of homelessness. She will today address the legal issues and the proposed wording, what the Constitution looks like now and how it could be improved and why we need a referendum. So I'll hand you all over to Aoife.
Thanks, Anne. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining the webinar. So I'm going to get straight into talking about, I suppose, trying to set a bit of context to how housing is currently dealt with in the Constitution, what things look like, why we think that needs to be changed, and one of the forms that that change could look like. I suppose, look, I'm a lawyer. I'm talking about this from a legal angle, and a lot of the conversation about a right to housing that's happening kind of public discourse in papers and on radio tends to be lawyers and academics talking to each other about various technical things. But I do think it's always important to kind of remind ourselves of what a right to housing is about, really. And you know, even though all the technical wording things are important, and I'm going to talk about that, you know, it is really about something as basic as where people lay their heads at night, and about all of us as people being able to have somewhere to call home. And really recognizing a right to housing is about saying, first and foremost, as a society, that we want everyone to be able to do that, and then working backwards from, well, how do we actually achieve that in our law and in our system, when at the moment, I don't think anyone would be completely satisfied with the way that housing is currently working in this country. So just to kind of give a bit of context for people who maybe aren't as familiar with the Constitution and constitutional law, in Ireland we have a written constitution, Bunreacht na hÉireann, and that sets out the fundamental law of Ireland, and it guarantees certain fundamental rights. It does that in 2 ways. We have some enumerated rights, which are expressly written in the Constitution, and then we also have unenumerated rights, which have been recognised by courts as really flowing from the natural law that all of us as people have certain rights. Because the Constitution is so important, it can only be changed by a referendum. So the government can't change the Constitution themselves. It has to be done by a vote of the people. There has to be a majority vote in a referendum of the public for the Constitution to be changed. And the consultation that this webinar is talking about, the public consultation that's being held, is looking for input on holding a referendum on housing. It's not more specific than that, but at Home for Good, what we're proposing is that there should be a referendum, absolutely, and it should be about asking the people if they want to vote for a right to access adequate housing to be recognised in the Constitution as one of the basic rights that's protected. And, you know, the Constitution covers a lot of different rights as it stands. It covers things like equality before the law, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the right to education, the right to own private property, a variety of different things. But at the moment, the Irish Constitution doesn't address housing as a general right at all. It's not a written right, and the courts have not been willing to read it in as an implied or unwritten right. And the way that housing is set up in the Constitution is, if anything, possibly worse than there just being a gap, because the Constitution does deal with housing in the context of the inviolability of the dwelling and the right to own private property, but it only does it from the focus really of private property ownership, mostly. And that's mostly in a lot of ways a reflection of the fact that the Constitution was written in the 1930s, and that was, you know, a very different time in the way that we looked at housing. And what that means is that at the moment, the Constitution is just fundamentally not balanced. And anytime you look at any legal analysis of regulating land, it always has to start from the perspective of property ownership and considering how people actually use that property, and if particularly using it from a housing perspective, only comes in as part of an overall assessment of what we call the common good, which is a much more kind of vague and nebulous term. Now, as I mentioned at the start, there's been a lot of debate already among lawyers and academics and different kind of policy talking heads about whether or not what's in the Constitution currently stops the government from making progressive housing policies. And some people feel the government could go a lot further than it currently does, even with the Constitution we have. But I suppose regardless of those arguments, the reality is that at the moment, the Constitution is continuously cited by different governments of different political leanings as a reason that they can't pursue different progressive housing policies, or they can't be creative or responsive to housing crisis. And I think some of the other speakers are going to talk about this in more detail, so I won't labour it, but there was just one a report done, I think in 2019 by the Oireachtas Research Office, which showed a number of different housing proposals that had been rejected out of hand at very early stages because of constitutional concerns. So I suppose that's coming at it from the perspective of, you know, what the Constitution allows, but the Constitution does do a lot more than just allow the government to do something. And I think it's important to always bear that in mind, that the Constitution also frames what society holds as its values and what the society wants the state to protect. And at a really basic level, the way the Constitution is currently framed, it sets the state as a protector of the private interest, but it doesn't give the state any corresponding explicit role in ensuring that people can meet their fundamental need to access housing. And that imbalance means that housing is very much looked at as a commodity or a financial asset, and the aspect of housing that's really basically related to our human rights is just not considered at that really fundamental level. And, you know, others I think are going to be talking about this in a lot more detail, but I think in Ireland right now, we're seeing the fallout of looking at housing purely as a financial commodity and where that leaves us. And recognising a right to housing in the Constitution in the right way would help to reset that overall policy approach and reframe the way that housing policy is looked at. One of the things that people sometimes ask when we talk about a right to housing is, like, why do we need a referendum? Could you not just maybe have some legislation or something like that? I've spoken now about some of the reasons around the constitutional imbalances, but also ultimately, when housing isn't a constitutionally protected right, it allows it to be a bit more of a political football, and housing policy is something that changes from day to day, changes with different governments and depending on what's happening. Whereas if we were to guarantee a right to housing in the Constitution, it would put an onus on every government, regardless of its political composition, to ensure that their policies give effect to this basic need of people. That could be through various different things, but just even like ensuring that there's enough private housing near the right kind of infrastructure so people can afford to buy houses where they need them, so that there's more affordable housing, a more functional rental market, or for people who really need the support, social housing, various different things like that. And so this is all why we're proposing that there will be a right to housing introduced in Irish law that isn't just something that's put in legislation, but that's put in the same footing and an equal footing of other fundamental rights that we value, like the right to education, like the right to private property, and all of these other basic constitutional rights. And recognise it in the Constitution also means that it can't ever be taken away without the government going back to the people. No individual government can decide to devalue housing when it's in the Constitution. It's something that the people have put there and only the people can take away again. So that's sort of why, some of the reasons why we think a change is needed, but what might it look like? So again, I think Anne-Marie later on is going to talk about what Home for Good are proposing in terms of wording and what you can put in terms of maybe into this consultation. And there's a lot of different ways a right to housing can be incorporated into Irish law, but certainly our view is that the most important things is that it's a standalone right. So it's recognised as a right to housing. It's not just tacked on as an aspect of property or an aspect of some other right. That it's a justiciable right, which means that it's a right that if in a really extreme situation it could be enforced in the courts, and that it's an expressly recognised right in the Constitution, that it's not just implied. So there is a particular wording that I think is going to come up on the screen later on in Anne-Marie's presentation, but the particular wording that Home for Good are proposing is that a new article will be added to the Constitution that says the state recognises and shall vindicate the right of all persons to have access to adequate housing, and that the state shall, through legislative and other measures, provide for the realisation of this right within its available resources. Now, there's a lot of different aspects to that wording, and if I had the time, we could spend half an hour talking about why that particular wording was chosen and where it comes from, but we don't have the time for that today. So I suppose I'm going to just leave it there, and just maybe kind of the last thing to say really is, you know, there can be a lot of academic debate about what this exact right to do would do, what this exact wording would do or wouldn't do. But ultimately, I think everybody who's here today, I'm sure, would agree that there is something broken in the housing system in Ireland at every different level. And recognising a right to housing isn't going to fix that. It's not going to fix everything overnight, but it does give a really important foundation to resetting it. And it would help, you know, really press on the urgency of resolving this crisis. And it would put something in place that can't be repealed or backed out from or moved away from. And, you know, housing crisis in Ireland has been dragging on so long. I think what it was declared an emergency 5 years ago, which is an absurdity. And when something goes on as long as that, even when it's a crisis, it just starts to become normal, and it starts to be a risk that people just start to accept in society, that there's always going to be a certain level of instability and homelessness. But recognising a constitutional right to housing in a referendum, in a majority vote, would be a really powerful statement that Irish society doesn't accept an endemic housing crisis, and that people want to put the government back on the hook for actually sorting out housing in this country. And that also has an awful lot of value, as well as all of the more technical legal aspects that would bring in. So I might leave it there. And I think, I'm going to hand over to, sorry, I'm not sure who's going next, so I'll hand back to you.
Don't worry, I'll thank you very much, Aoife. That was very clear and direct. And I'm sure there'll be interesting questions coming at the Q&A afterwards. Two things just to mention, just to remind people that this webinar is being recorded. And we would ask you to submit any questions you have through the Q&A function that's there. Also, it will be available on podcast through Reboot Republic if you would like to re-listen. The other item to mention is that we are going to conduct a poll both now and later on, perhaps in the middle of the Q&A, to see if we're managing to sway anyone's opinion. So the poll is a very simple question. Are you in favour of a constitutional right to housing? Yes, no, undecided. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Dr. Rory Hearn, who's Assistant Professor in Social Policy, Department of Applied Social Studies in Maynooth University. He has a book called Housing Shock, The Irish Housing Crisis and How to Solve It, well worth getting your hands on. And he's host of Reboot Republic podcast on inequality, housing and contemporary social and political issues. So he will speak to the following: the entrenched housing crisis, longer term housing trends, home ownership collapse, homelessness figures, evictions ban and rent freeze refusal, what adequate housing means, the definition of that, and obligations that would follow for the state from a right to housing being inserted in the Constitution. So over to Rory. Thanks.
Thanks, Anne, and welcome everyone as well. It's great to see so many people here and be part of this very, I think, historic moment where we are at the point at which we could have a referendum on the right to housing, which so many of us have been working so long and advocating for. And it is really, I do have a sense of hope about this. While there's a lot of hopelessness about so much of housing, I think in this area we do have a real opportunity. And I suppose the starting point is that we need to understand that the Housing Commission is not automatically going to recommend a right to housing referendum, that it could make any number of recommendations and it might not recommend the right to housing at all. And that's why we're encouraging people to make a submission to the Housing Commission to call for a right to housing, specifically referendum, and hopefully they will make that recommendation. I suppose that's what we're making the case for today. And I'm going to give some slides here, and I will present them, and I'm not going to go through all the detail on them. We'll make them available and you can have a look at them in your own time. And there is a lot in the Home for Good submission on our website as well, which people can look at, and it is well worth going through. And where possible, I would encourage people to try and put their own submission in, because I think the more individualized it is, the better it will be. And hopefully out of this, we will have that recommendation coming forward. And then, of course, with the process of government taking on board and holding that referendum. But in terms of the, I suppose, the context of this, and many of you would be, you know, very, very familiar with a lot of this, but just to run through, maybe perhaps for some people who aren't as familiar, the point is that we're making the case why the Housing Commission should recommend, as Aoife set out there, a referendum to insert a clear and substantive right to housing in the Constitution. And our point that we use in our wording that's proposed is this concept of adequate housing. And we are drawing directly, as Aoife said, from the United Nations, which defines a right to housing. And if people are looking for more on this, we can provide them. The United Nations has set out very clearly a number of aspects of what is the right to housing, and includes, importantly for people, things like legal security of tenure, affordable housing, habitable, which means it's of decent standard, and things like culturally adequate. So it's not just the right to housing isn't something that is abstract. It's actually been worked out quite detailed by the United Nations. And this is what we're proposing that the government should, which of course the Irish state already is signed up to this in international covenants and treaties, but of course it's not in any legal basis in Irish law currently. The UN rapporteur, Leilani Farah, who again some of you might be familiar with, has set out why housing should be treated as a human right. And again, Aoife alluded to this. And her quote from this in 2017, I think, is worth re-looking at, because what she said was that housing is the basis of stability and security for an individual or family. It is the center of our social, emotional, and sometimes economic lives. A home should be a sanctuary, a place to live in, peace, security, and dignity. But of course, housing has been financialized, valued as a commodity rather than a human dwelling. And we have seen that very acutely in Ireland over the last decade, indeed over the last 2 decades. And it has become, for investors, a means to secure and accumulate wealth rather than a place to live in dignity, to raise a family and thrive within a community. And as she makes a very important point that deprivations of the right to adequate housing, which means violations of that right, or where it's not fulfilled, are not just what she describes as program failures or policy challenges, but they are human rights violations of the highest order, depriving those affected of the most basic human right to dignity, security, and even life itself. And why I show this is because it's highlighting that housing isn't just any right. Housing as a human right is the most fundamental need, and without it, you cannot actually live, you cannot have a life. And so when we make the case that housing should be constitutionalized as a human right, it is down to this, that housing is such a fundamental need and requirement that it should be in our constitution as an obligation of the state. And I would argue, and I think many would agree, that we have now this endemic housing crisis that has reached a point where some radical and fundamental changes are needed. And again, you'd be familiar with these, you know, it is, and it's been described by our president, President Michael D. Higgins, as a social disaster. We have a generation locked out of being able to have an affordable, secure home of their own, 350,000 20 to 35-year-olds living at home as adults, increasingly emigrating, the collapse in home ownership rates, rental poverty, and of course intersecting with the cost of living crisis, unprecedented homelessness, and of course the economic impacts of this. High housing costs mean an ever-rising state subsidy on rents, areas of the public and private sector being unable to find key workers, increased poverty. And it is in particular scarring a generation of children, and children are a particular group within human rights who are supposed to be given particular protection given their vulnerability. And for a child, a secure home base is fundamental for them to develop. But yet 1/4 of children growing up in this country do not have a secure, safe home. They are in the insecure private rental sector. Almost 1 in 3 children living in poor households in Ireland are growing up in substandard housing conditions, that is damp, leaking, mold, and a child who experiences homelessness, which we know there are thousands each year, are experiencing what is called an adverse childhood experience. And we know, for example, some of the figures are really staggering in terms of homelessness. And I'm going to briefly discuss how homelessness was being reduced during COVID, but has been reversed. You know, and for example, half of families with children are there longer than 6 months, which is close to 1,000 children living in emergency accommodation for longer than 6 months. At a policy level, housing policy in Ireland has never recognised housing as a human right. And we have seen, I would argue, as a result of this shift from building public housing to subsidising the private market from really the late 1980s onwards. And you can see this through the 1970s and earlier. Ireland built a huge amount of public housing. But then there was the first austerity years in the 1980s, the shift to the market. Even during the Celtic Tiger, it increased, but it was still tiny as a proportion of overall housing provision. And then, of course, we had the austerity years and the ongoing shift to the marketisation of housing, which we have seen really culminate in the last 5 years with the emergence of the housing assistance payment as the key form of social housing. And why this is important, because research that myself and others have done have shown that housing assistance payment as a form of social housing does not actually provide a right to housing. It does not provide secure housing, nor does it provide affordable housing. We also have the major issue of vacancy, again, shown by the CSO. And I would make the case, and Aoife and others have set it out, that the Constitution currently is a barrier to housing solutions. And I will give 2 examples of this. The COVID eviction ban and the rent freeze, and providing genuine security of tenure to tenants. If we look at the evictions in the private rental sector, in early mid-2019, it was the first time landlords were required to notify the RTB of evictions taking place. We saw this increase of evictions. Then we had COVID, and the moratorium or ban on evictions were introduced more or less during this period. A significant drop in the second quarter of 2020, an increase, and then the reintroduced a fall again. But since that eviction moratorium was lifted, this huge increase in evictions taking place in the private rental sector, the overwhelming majority because landlords are selling, and this is leading to a major rise in homelessness, because during this period of the eviction bans, we saw a dramatic reduction in homelessness. Similarly, rents, during the period of COVID, there was a rent freeze introduced. Similarly, rents reduced to their lowest levels of increase in many, many years. And since the ban has been lifted, we have seen children and families, a significant increase in children and families becoming homeless, and individuals as well. Now, the argument is that, well, it's not just the Constitution that's stopping the government, it's not the Constitution that's stopping the government bringing in, extending, for example, the eviction ban, or reducing or removing the ability of landlords to evict a tenant on sale, that it is, different political reasons and policy reasons. But if you look at what the government ministers have said, what they actually say is that it's very clear, and this is a quote from Peter Burke, Fine Gael TD, saying, while it may be easy for the opposition to say we should disregard the advice of the Attorney General, that is in suggesting we should extend eviction bans or test the legislation in the courts, the reality is that government must ensure that any legislation we pass is proportionate, legal, constitutional, and is not open to challenge. And the point has been made that even proposals such as extending the eviction bans can't even be brought forward by the government when there is a potential constitutional issue. And of course, in this case, it's the constitutional protection of private property held by landlords that is essentially acting as, even if we take it the government wanted to, it couldn't introduce because it is a potential constitutional interference with the rights of private property of landlords. Similarly, Darragh O'Brien, as Minister for Housing, referred to this. For example, he's referred to the unsustainable blanket eviction ban being not legally sustainable. And a senator from the Green Party outlined this very clearly when he said in the same debate about introducing extension on the eviction bans, that he said our ultra-conservative steps, which he's referring to the cautious policy legislation, is for fear we will trespass or engage property rights in a negative way, are tying at least one hand behind our back at times as legislators. So either he is not speaking the truth, or this is the reality, which I take it at. The reality is they are, at a certain extent, their hands are tied behind their back as legislators because of the constitutional protection of private property. The other example, I won't go into detail in terms of time at the moment, but it is something, is the recent introduction of tenancies of unlimited duration. They are only for new tenancies, and landlords can still evict tenants where they're selling a property. And as Darragh O'Brien said, part of the reason for this is because of they have to respect the property rights of landlords. There are three things I think a referendum on inserting the right to housing would do. The first thing is that it would provide a catalyst and a driver for fundamentally solving the housing disaster, because it would give an opportunity to the public to express their view and belief and support for the right to housing, which would provide the government with a requirement and a mandate to deliver major change on housing. And it would also importantly empower, educate and inform those whose rights have been violated, those who are affected by the crisis, that they do have a right to housing. Secondly, it would provide greater ability for the government to implement housing solutions, such as tenant protections and homelessness prevention, tackling in vacancy and dereliction on land. And thirdly, I think most importantly, it would create a constitutional requirement for the government and the state to solve the housing crisis. It would create a clear constitutional obligation and responsibility to fulfill the right to housing in policy and practice. And so I think if we look at policy-wise, it would require housing policy to be redesigned and redeveloped to implement the right to housing. And this would have to be backed up by necessary funding. And I would argue that, for example, meeting the constitutional obligation of a right to adequate housing would require the rapid ending of child and family homelessness. It would require greater state funding and resources being put into a sufficient supply of affordable, decent standard housing, for example, the greater provision of public housing. It is important, I suppose, on the hopeful side of this, that there is growing support across parties for the right to housing. A motion was passed in the Seanad by all parties that in support of a constitutional right to housing. And just to end up, I think that there is a clear desire from the majority of Irish people to ensure everyone has a home as a human right. And that really there is a significant change has happened, and the housing crisis is at such a state that and such a disaster that people are really demanding this change. And we would argue that, as with the marriage equality and repeal referendums, this does offer the opportunity for a value shift that understands and seeks the provision of housing as a home, as a human right for every citizen. So thank you very much, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Rory. That was a magnificent whistle-stop tour through all the policy considerations around the forthcoming referendum. So thank you very much for that. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions coming through. Our next speaker, our final speaker for the afternoon, is Anne-Marie O'Reilly, who's the policy officer with Threshold, who everybody will know is the housing charity which seeks to prevent homelessness and supports people with difficulties in their private rented tenancies. Prior to working with Threshold, Anne-Marie worked for 10 years in homeless services, seeing firsthand the damage done by homelessness and the need for action to stop homelessness from occurring in the first place. So I'll hand you over to Anne-Marie. Thank you very much.
Thanks a million, Anne. So hi everyone, I'm just going to start off by sharing my screen. So that seems to have worked. So I'm going to say a little bit about why we need to see constitutional change, which is building on what Aoife and Rory have said. And I'll talk about the public consultation, which the Housing Commission is holding right now, and how you can make your submission. So but essentially what we're saying is, we want you to use your voice. I suppose in Ireland over the last number of years, we've had some big constitutional change. And as Rory said, these reflect a value shift in our country. And this is another opportunity for us all to use our voice to change our constitution. And I guess we're at the slightly early stages of it, because what we're trying to do at the moment is actually have that referendum held. So the examples have been given. There's a number of times the government have said we cannot take certain action because it's unconstitutional. And well, if the constitution is preventing us from taking necessary actions to stop homelessness or resolve the housing crisis, then I guess we have to change the constitution. And the constitution is a living document, so it's not unusual for it to be amended or adjusted. And as Aoife said, it's only we, the people, that can do so. And it is for us to do that. And I suppose it's a responsibility as well, but that's, we have the power to do that. So I want to just mention a couple of pieces of legislation that never got off the ground. Aoife mentioned there was a report done in 2019 that highlighted proposed bills that were blocked because they were deemed to be unconstitutional. I'm just going to highlight 3 of these here for you. So the first one is the Family Home Mortgage Settlement Arrangement Bill. That was in 2014 that was brought forward, and that would have given the Insolvency Service of Ireland powers to have mortgages on family homes restructured. That's, when there would have been arrears on the mortgage. And when I say family homes, I mean principal dwelling homes. So the home that you have the mortgage on, that is your principal dwelling, your home. So at that time, the bill was published, there were approximately 110,000 mortgages on family homes that were in arrears, about 13% of all mortgage accounts. So remember, this is a number of years after the crash, but the effects of it were still being felt. People were losing their homes, people were getting into arrears and were really, really struggling. But the bill was not progressed, and the then Minister for Justice and Equality stated that the bill had not taken into consideration the balance between those in arrears and the property rights of the banks. So just that's one of the things that was said there. You'll see a theme emerging. Then we have the Mortgage Arrears Resolution Family Home Bill in 2017. That would have allowed for the establishment of a mortgage arrears tribunal that could have ordered banks and lenders to restructure mortgages. So at present, there's a code of conduct in place, and the banks are expected to conduct themselves a certain way and engage with the person in arrears, but there's no real maybe obligation on them. And this would have changed that. But the then Minister for Justice and Equality stated this would be an infringement on the bank's vested property rights under Article 40 of the Constitution. And then we get on to the No Consent, No Sale Bill that was put forward in 2019. And this would have prevented banks and lenders from selling your mortgage without your permission. That seems like a very reasonable proposal, but the Minister of State at the Department of Rural and Community Development declared it potentially unconstitutional. So none of these were able to progress. Unconstitutional, no good, not going anywhere. Now, if, however, we'd had a right to housing in the Constitution, it means that the government of the day could not have dismissed these bills and many others like them just out of hand. They would have had to examine them in the light of the right to housing and the right to private property and strike a balance if one was to be had. Now, it doesn't mean that all of the bills would have progressed, maybe necessarily in the original form. Some may not have progressed at all, but they would have had to have been considered. And this is why we need the right to housing in the Constitution, and this is why we have to take the action to bring about that change. So if we have right to housing in the Constitution, it would mean that any further measures, such as these, for example, would need to be given full and proper consideration by the government of the day. So there's plenty more examples in that report that was published in 2019. So the Housing Commission then, it began its work earlier this year. It was established last year, but it met for the first time this year. And one of its first actions was to establish a subgroup to examine the need for a referendum on housing and what form that referendum should take. And they held a 2-day conference on the right to housing earlier this year with a panel of Irish and international experts. And the next stage of this process is to hear from the public on whether there should A, be a referendum on housing, and B, what form this should take. And so the closing date to make this submission is the 2nd of September. And we really want to encourage members of the public to make their thoughts on this known to the Commission. I'm going to sound like a broken record because it is the people who can change the constitution. It is only the people who can change the constitution. So how to make your thoughts known? Email them. Simple as that. Tell them if you think there should be a referendum on housing, if you believe this should be a referendum on the right to housing, and whether you support the wording put forward by Home for Good. So I have that wording up here on the screen, and Aoife touched on it earlier. And so it has the couple of different aspects to it. It is a standalone wording. It would create a new article. It would be Article 43A in the Constitution. It would have equal weight to other rights, such as the right to private property. It would be enforceable. So it means if any government is derelict in its duty in vindicating this right, they can be held to account. They can't shirk their responsibility. And in the second part, then, the state should provide, through legislative and other measures, provide for realisation of this right within its available resources. And so that's to say, and it's a point we make in our submission, the right doesn't create resources, but it puts a duty on the state to use the resources it has to the best of its ability to ensure we have access to adequate housing. And I won't get into the definition of adequate housing. Rory did touch on that. So it places a positive duty on the state, and that is something that is realised over time. And if you're not up for, also you can check out the details of this at homeforgood.ie/act. But if you're not up for writing your own email, you can use a letter template. So on the Threshold website, we have created a handy little letter template. It should open up from here now. You can jump on, put in your details, and you can or cannot sign up for updates, so don't worry about that. You're not obliged to give us your details. You can edit the letter if you want to add some of your own personal thoughts or views or opinions on the right to housing. Hit next step and you can send your email away to the Commission. So those are the ways in which you can make your submission. Hang on a minute. It's as simple as that, and we'd encourage everyone to make their thoughts known to the Commission, and also to amplify the message, get talking to people about it, family, friends, about the need for a right to housing, what it means to you, and as always, share it on social media. If it wasn't shared on social media, it didn't happen. Okay, so thanks a million. Oh, Anne, you're on mute.
Okay, great. I'm unmuted. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. That's great, and so easy to make that submission to the Housing Commission. Anne-Marie has given you a step-by-step intro as to how to do that, and it'll only take, I'd say, 5 minutes of your time. So we hope that you will do that. So without further ado, we have some questions coming in on the Q&A, and perhaps we might just take a few of those. We won't take all of them. There's quite a number there, but we'll take some. So the question I was hoping to ask Aoife to deal with the question which has come in, which I'll read to you. The South African model of a constitutional right to housing has come under some significant criticism for failing to concretely improve the living conditions of vulnerable and our marginalised litigants, as it is framed as a right to access to adequate housing rather than a standalone right to adequate housing. This is an obvious cause for concern. Should we expect the Irish experience to be different, particularly as we do not have a culture of transformative constitutionalism as in South Africa? Now, it's a bit of a mouthful. It's a good question. So I'm hoping that Aoife would run with that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, it is a very good question. And just for people who don't spend their time reading comparative constitutional law, the South African model is quite relevant because South Africa has a somewhat similar legal system to Ireland, not identical, but somewhat similar. And certainly when Home for Good was preparing the wording we're proposing, we looked at the South African wording in a lot of detail. Maybe just to address another question is there, someone asked what other countries have a right to housing. Yes. A lot. I think it's about 80 countries recognise some type of right to housing. So Ireland would most certainly not be in a minority if it was to also recognise one. But the South African model is a bit similar to what we might look at. Look, there's certainly been, I think, a little bit of disappointment with how it's actually played out. But when we look at putting a right into the Constitution, I mean, firstly, a constitutional right can't and it shouldn't direct that something really specific happens. This type of a right is about setting, a policy level. When the government is setting policy, it needs to be considering these rights. So it is going to take time for those rights to be realised and for that to have effect. I think what that's talking about there is around when it came to court enforcement of that right, where people were looking to challenge what the state was doing in South Africa in the courts. They were maybe disappointed with how the courts enforce that. The government are the people who make policy. The courts aren't the people who should be making housing policy. They should only be standing in where the government are completely failing to do it. So what you don't want, and what wouldn't be the case in the Irish system based on our constitutional history, is for courts to be being really directive about what the government does with policy. But by having a right to housing in our constitution, what we would have is a very basic floor that the state can't fall below. And if it does fall below that, they will be taken to task. And we think the wording that we've suggested would do that, and it would give that basic floor of protection. And right now we don't have it at all. So it certainly has a value, even though I can absolutely see that in certain jurisdictions there's been difficulties in implementing it. But that's then for everyone to hold government to account and for the state to be held to account to do it right. So I'm not sure if that completely answered that question, but I hope that did somewhat.
Very helpful. Thank you. Thanks, Aoife. Anne-Marie, if I could ask you to address the question which has come up on, just bear with me now for 1 second. Yeah. There is a social stigma to living in council estates. This is the questioner. How much do you think this affects the public support for increasing state-built homes? Sorry. And how do you think this might affect a referendum on a right to housing? There's a second leg to this question, which is a separate issue, if you like, but perhaps you might deal with it also, please, Anne-Marie. There's comments coming through on social media that a referendum on the right to housing is part of an effort to strip citizens of their existing private property rights to make way for further corporate capture of land or property. How can we best tackle this misinformation? So I hope you're okay to run with those, Anne-Marie.
Yeah, no problem at all. Yeah, and actually in relation to the second one, on the misinformation about the right to housing being a way to take away people's homes, like myself and my colleagues made somewhat of a tongue-in-cheek video about this in the office yesterday, and it's up online. I really shouldn't be promoting it, but I am. The right to home does not take away private property rights. The right to home or the right to housing stands alongside the right to private property rights, and they have to be balanced against each other. And if you are a homeowner, and we have a right to housing, then you are protected by your right to private property and your right to home. I've seen it. We've heard it, that this idea that's been spread about, that it's a way of taking people's homes or property away from them. That is not what we are proposing here. I am aware that there was a bill proposed some years ago, and that the word for right to housing, and the wording of that may have led some may give that idea, but that's not what we're talking about right now. We're proposing something very specific, and it in no way is trying to take away from people the right to private property. It's a stand alongside it, and they're to be balanced against each other when tensions arise, as is the case with all rights. When tensions arise, they need to be balanced against each other. So no, it can be difficult, but when it's thrown up, but that's essentially it. There are two rights, you can hold both at the same time. And then in relation to the stigma around social housing, certainly that stigma has increased dramatically over the years, and I suppose it's partially to do with the state stepping back from its role in social housing and there not being as much of it. But you hear the stories from so many people who say, well, I grew up in a council estate and it was grand, it was lovely, it was fine. Council estates and social housing can be and should be diverse communities, people of all walks of life. And that is maybe something we need to be moving back towards. And maybe that is something that can be achieved through a right to housing, because when we talk about right to housing, we're not just talking about purely state provision of social housing. We're talking about the state ensuring all of us can access housing, no matter the tenure. So that might be traditional local authority housing, that might be new tenures such as cost rental, it might be through renting privately, but knowing I'm not going to be evicted in a couple of months' time for no wrongdoing, and it could, and then other schemes in relation to home ownership. So it's the whole gamut of housing options that the government would be obliged to facilitate access to. But yeah, all we can do is, I suppose, dispel those misconceptions about what council housing, social housing, and the right to housing is.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Very much on the ball as usual. Very, very well done. I think perhaps at this juncture we might ask the same question again. We'll do the poll just to see if we're making any headway. It may be a little bit early, but are you in favor of a constitutional right to housing? Answer yes, no, I am undecided. So it's up on your screens there, and you might answer it. Thank you. There are a couple of other questions that we'd like to deal with. One for Rory. Just bear with me now. I want to make sure I'm asking Rory the correct question. Oh yeah, here we are. There's a lot of questions here. Okay, so the questioner says, I'm interested in the interplay between a right to housing and other rights, such as a right to health, privacy, and so on, and how those rights could strengthen the argument for a right to housing, as without a house or a home, other rights can be denied to people. So that's one. And then tagged along with that, Rory, is another question which has just come in, and it says that there seems to be a perception amongst some members of the public that Home for Good is a front organisation for a political party. The questioner doesn't believe it himself, but is there anything that can be said to reassure the public that this isn't the case? So maybe, Rory, you would field both of those questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I think that in terms of the first one, I think it's a really good question. And the issue of a right to housing and other rights and how it interacts, I spoke about in my presentation, and Aoife referred to as well, other aspects such as, for example, education. A right to education for children is impacted by the lack of housing, lack of adequate housing. The area of health, as is mentioned, absolutely, health and housing are integral, and there's huge impacts of housing on health, and in particular, again, the issues of substandard housing, mold, dampness, traveller accommodation, for example, the private rental sector, tenants having to put up with severe issues of substandard accommodation, which has both physical and mental health impacts. And then in terms of the issue of privacy as well, as a good one, and Aoife mentioned this, there are some rights currently in the Constitution that can be drawn on to assert certain aspects of the right to housing, but the right to housing absolutely is fundamental for those other ones as well. And so with a right to housing, it would offer the opportunity to enhance those other rights as well. And so I think that in both ways makes an argument for the right to housing. In terms of the political party question, I think it's very clear. You can go on to the Home for Good website as to who we are. We have it very clear. It's a coalition, as Anne said in the outset, of NGOs like Threshold, Focus Ireland, the Mercy Law Centre, the Simon Communities, and also academic experts like myself, legal experts who support us as well. And that is who it is. So straight up, you know, that's we can let people know who we are. And I just wanted to reference, there was a question there in relation to the, I think it was a question around the question of the right to housing referendum. If the government put forward something that's meaningless and would give little impact. And I think that that's, again, something we're emphasizing. Why we're emphasizing this right to housing needs to be very clear, standalone, is because that would be a substantive requirement on government. And so the way that we can influence government is by trying to influence the Housing Commission and what they put forward, and then hopefully they will, and then there will be the opportunity then to continue to highlight to government that they do follow through with a referendum that does put in a substantive, meaningful right to housing.
Thanks, Rory. I'm going to deal with two further questions. One is for Aoife, and it is the question interested into why, if I heard you correctly, that you're proposing access to a right to housing for all people. What does that mean? Citizens, residents, immigrants? So that's one question. I'll ask Aoife to address that in a moment. And then the second question, which is for Anne-Marie, is thanks for the great presentations, and two questions. When can we expect the department to publish the recommendations? And the second is it too early to start organising locally or nationally for the campaign itself if there is a referendum to be proposed? So if I go to Anne-Marie first, Aoife first, to deal with the question of who the right would apply to. Thanks, Aoife.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, so I suppose that question comes back to what a constitutional right is and what it's trying to achieve. So the right to housing would be put in on the same status as any other right in the Constitution, and you know that it would be put in as a basic right that the Constitution protects, and then how that right is delivered to different people in society and different people coming into the country depends on how it's delivered through policy and different things like that. A right to housing wouldn't prevent the government from having any restrictions on access, in the same way that the right to earn a livelihood doesn't mean that anyone can come to Ireland with no working visa. There can still be particular things that happen, but ultimately a right to housing is a human right, and it wouldn't be, at least, and this is maybe my own personal view, but it wouldn't be appropriate to carve that right out as somehow only applying to certain people. It's a basic right that we guarantee, and then how the state implements that within the order of the state is a matter of policy for the government.
Thanks, Aoife. That's excellent. And I think there has been some recent case law coming from the courts on the issue of certain rights and how they apply to people. So it's already an issue that the courts have addressed. So Anne-Marie, if I could ask you to deal with the other question as to when we expect a report, and whether we should already be lining up the big guns to get a referendum campaign underway. Thank you.
So we're hoping that the Commission will make its report to the department in November. And what we're actually saying in our submission is we're actually asking the Commission to recommend that the government, the Commission will make its report to the government. And we're actually asking that they recommend the government call a referendum as soon as possible after that. But we do know sometimes reports go to government or different departments, so we may not see the outcome from them for some while. But the government has committed to a referendum on housing. They committed to it in the programme for government. They committed to it again in Housing for All. And this has been set as a priority by the Commission. So hopefully we will see something soon after the Commission make their final report to the government in November. As regards taking out the big guns, if you have them, yeah, we will take them. But It's not, I know it's certainly not too early to start organizing, because we need to start having the conversations with those around us, with the people in our communities, about what the right to housing means. So that people can start to turn it over, I guess, in their own minds and get a better understanding. Because it can be a difficult concept for people to get their heads around, and there's quite a bit of misinformation out there. This idea, oh, is this a free house for everybody? No, it's not a free house for everybody. If only it was that simple. But this is why it is important for us to start those conversations. So yeah, I would certainly say yes, start having those conversations. You know, find out locally in your area who's interested in being involved when a referendum is called, because yeah, there will be campaigning. It'll, you know, and at this stage now we are, as a nation, fairly experienced in referendum campaigning.
Great. Thanks, Anne-Marie. I think we're ready to wrap the webinar at that. I think it's been a very useful exercise, and I think it's one that we will repeat as things develop. Perhaps once the report is going to government, it might be an opportune time to have another webinar. So please do make that submission to the Housing Commission. You've got until the 2nd of September to the public consultation, and also check out the Home for Good website. And I'll underscore what Rory has said very clearly, that we are absolutely not a front for any political party. We're you know, members of all sorts of different organizations and none, and the one thing we have in common is that we are not a front for a political party. So that let's put that lie to bed right away. So thank you very much to all the participants. We've had a great turnout. We're very pleased, and thanks also to our speakers today who've done us proud. Thank you very much.